Welcome to episode 3 of Running with Science. And what we're going to look at in this episode is a paper that looked at how intensity of carrying out physical exercise is associated with health, and particularly in how it's associated with longevity. So, a quick recap of what I talked about in episode 1. We saw that most people who took part in a marathon didn't stick to the 80-20 rule in their 16 weeks of training in the run up to the marathon. We saw that the higher proportion of their training that was in Z3, the worse their marathon time was. And it also didn't seem to matter whether this was at the start of their training or in the weeks leading up to the race. It just seemed to be bad whenever you did it. So this suggests that the negative impacts of training in Z3 could be long-term rather than just related to needing to recover from having worked hard. And what I want to talk about in this particular episode is another study that might well be hinting about what is actually going on here. So this is the study. It's called Long-Term Leisure Time Physical Activity Intensity and All-Cause and Cause-Specific Mortality. This was a study that followed the survivorship rates and levels of physical activity of 116,000 nurses in the US from 1976. They had surveys kind of every couple of years or so where the participants recorded their physical activity levels and types. What the researchers did was they then categorized different types of physical activity into those that they considered high intensity and low intensity. Now, it should be noted that these definitions are really quite different to those that were used in the Strava study I talked about in episode 1. So here they are calling high intensity exercise not just running, but basically any running at all, so jogging as well, swimming, cycling, any form of what they call aerobic sports. So if you're playing games such as squash, racquetball, tennis, or even just working outdoors or climbing stairs, they all count as high intensity exercise. Low intensity exercise is anything like walking, weightlifting, calisthenics, yoga, stretching. So quite a different demarcation of what is considered low and high intensity here. Okay, now this is what the study found in terms of the association between their two different classifications of physical activity and survivorship. So for their high intensity, which they labeled vigorous, we can see that individuals that are doing between 0 and 150 minutes of activity a week, every minute is giving them a good increase in their survivorship. So your chances of dying are lower for every minute of additional activity you do. Then when you reach about 150 minutes of activity, the vigorous physical activity curve really starts to flatten out quite considerably. It does continue to decline, but after about 150 minutes, it's suggesting that the benefits for additional vigorous activity are quite small. And it's this sort of data that the concept of doing 150 minutes of physical activity a week was actually developed. If you look at the moderate physical activity curve, this continues to go down further before it really starts to flatten out. And in fact, it continues to decline at a faster rate right down to 850 and 900 minutes of physical activity a week, it's still a steeper drop than vigorous physical activity is between about 150 and 200 minutes. So this is suggesting that the best way to increase your lifespan is to engage in moderate rather than vigorous physical activity. But we'll come back to that in a bit. This is the same plot, but this time we've taken out anybody who died as a result of cardiovascular disease. And you can see that the two lines have become a bit closer together. Okay. So this is hinting that the difference between moderate and vigorous activity could well be related to cardiovascular disease, and the impacts of the intensity of exercise are less important for other forms of mortality, although there is clearly still a difference between the two. This is the more surprising plot. So this is the plot for cardiovascular disease mortality. And what you can see here is up to 150 minutes, it goes down. Mortality rates go down for both groups, the amount of both types of exercise. But once you hit about 150 minutes, the slope of the line for vigorous activity doesn't just flatten out, it actually starts to go upwards. So this is now hinting that there's something about some of the things that are labeled vigorous physical activity that actually are bad for your cardiovascular health. And what you can also see here is that lower intensity physical activity seems to be particularly good for your cardiovascular health, because the rate of drop of the moderate physical activity line is still good the more and more and more you do it. So what is going on here? Well, I think we need to put these two studies together. I do not think that everything that they have classed as vigorous activity is going to be contributing towards cardiovascular disease if you do more than 150 minutes of it a week. But I think there's probably something in there that is causing the effect. So I don't think it's likely to be jogging or playing tennis. I think the most likely explanation for this uptick in mortality rates if you do more than 150 minutes of vigorous activity a week is likely to be related to doing what we classed as high intensity anaerobic zone 3 activities in the previous Strava paper. We saw in that paper that there was a really strong association between amount of Z3 activity you did, portion of Z3 activity you did, and your finishing timing in a marathon, showing that Z3 activities were very bad for your marathon times. And we also saw that it didn't really seem to matter how far away from the marathon you did these things. They're hinting that high intensity anaerobic training is bad for you. I think the best explanation of what's going on here is that doing anaerobic Z3 vigorous activity could be bad for your cardiovascular health. I think that is the simplest explanation of what's going on. I suspect that what we classed as Z2 and Z1 in the previous studies are not particularly harming your cardiovascular system. Indeed, I suspect Z1 training is probably actually much more like the grey curve here than the black curve that we saw associated with mortality. So I don't want to put anybody off doing lots of zone 1 training, because I suspect this is not associated with increases in mortality associated with cardiovascular disease. But I do worry that anaerobic Z3 training could be associated with issues in terms of cardiovascular disease. And it is likely that when you're in Z3, when you're exercising anaerobically, that you are creating a stress response, and that stress response could be doing something that is not good for your cardiovascular system. I'm going to see if I can find any other papers that give us more information about what might be going on here, and I particularly think that we need more studies looking at this. But that is my interpretation of what is going on with these two studies. Before I finish, I just want to revisit episode 2. And in episode 2, I explained to you how to calculate your critical speed and lactate threshold. Many thanks to Martin Smith. Martin has pointed out to me that there is a website that does this for you. So if you go to the website called Norwegian Signals Training Calculator, which is hosted by something called LacTrace, you will find a calculator that will do all the maths for you. It will actually do the maths for you for any combination of distances, as far as I can tell. I would strongly suggest that you use 400 and 5K as your pair of distances, or 800 meters and 5K, because studies suggest that these are the most accurate for predicting your critical speed and lactate threshold. Okay. And I assure you that Norwegian Singles, despite the title, is not a Scandi dating site. It is a site that does help you